Subscribe to this channel and tap the bell icon so we can continue this journey. The weight of silence. Elias had been praying for 11 months. Every morning before the sun rose over the cracked earth of his small farm in the dry hills of Galilee, he knelt on the same worn stone beside his bed. His knees knew the shape of it, the way a river knows its banks. He pressed his forehead to his clasped hands and he spoke, quietly, desperately, honestly, into a silence that felt more like a wall than a sky. He had prayed for his daughter, Miriam, who had not spoken a single word since the fever took her voice 9 months ago. The healers shook their heads. The scrolls gave him no comfort. Even his neighbors, who once admired his faith, began to say things in low voices when he walked past. Things like, perhaps it is his sin, and perhaps God has moved on. Elias heard them. He always heard them. But here is what no one tells you about a man who prays in the dark. The darkness becomes familiar, and in that familiarity, something strange takes root. On this particular morning, the morning everything would change, though he did not know it yet, Elias rose before the birds. He noticed something he had not noticed before. Beside the stone on which he prayed, a tiny green shoot had broken through the dry, cracked ground. Just one, barely the width of his thumb. It had not been there the day before. He stared at it for a long time. Then he knelt beside it, and he prayed. Chapter 2. The Man at the Well. That afternoon, a stranger came to the village. No one had seen him before. He wore simple robes the color of sand, and his eyes, Elias noticed immediately, were the kind of eyes that made you feel he already knew your name and everything that went with it. He sat at the village well in the center of the market and spoke with anyone who stopped. Most people were too busy. A few stopped out of curiosity. A woman named Deborah spoke with him for nearly an hour and returned to her house weeping. But weeping the way a person weeps after a heavy rain breaks a long drought, with relief, not grief. Elias watched from a distance. He was afraid to approach. He was afraid of the stranger for the same reason he was afraid of hope. Because hope, when it breaks, cuts deeper than anything. But Miriam tugged at his sleeve. She had come to the market with him that day, as she always did, silent and watchful with her large dark eyes. She pointed at the man at the well. She pulled Elias's sleeve again. She was insistent in the way that only a mute child can be insistent, with her entire body. Elias let her pull him forward. Chapter 3. What he said about seeds. The stranger looked up as they approached. He smiled. Not a polite smile, not a stranger's smile, but the smile of someone who has been waiting. Sit, he said. And somehow, despite himself, Elias sat. For a while neither spoke. The stranger looked at Miriam, and Miriam looked back at him with a steadiness that Elias had never seen in her before, as if she recognized something ancient and familiar in this man's face. Finally, Elias could not keep it inside. The 11 months of kneeling, the wall of silence, the neighbors' whispers, it all came out in a single, raw sentence. I have prayed every day, and nothing has changed. The stranger did not flinch. He did not offer the usual reassurances. He reached down and picked up a small handful of the dry market dust and held it in his open palm. When a seed is planted, he said, it does not break ground on the first day, or the second, or the 10th. For weeks, it does nothing that you can see. But underground, it is doing the most important work of its life. The soil is being moved, the roots are reaching, the moment of breakthrough has already been decided. He let the dust fall from his hand, grain by grain. Your prayer, he said quietly looking at Elias, is not falling on empty ground. The ground beneath your prayer is already moving. You just cannot see it yet. Elias felt something crack open in his chest, not painfully, but the way an old window cracks open after a long winter to let the first spring air in. He blinked hard. He did not trust himself to speak. Chapter 4. The question that changed everything. Then the stranger did something unexpected. He turned to Miriam, not to Elias, not to the healers, not to God in the language of ceremony, but directly to the small, silent girl. What What would you say, he asked her gently, if you could say one thing? The market noise continued around them. A donkey brayed, children ran past. Time felt strange and thick, like honey. Miriam opened her mouth. For a moment, just a moment, nothing came. And in that moment, Elias held every prayer he had ever prayed like a stone in his fist, bracing for the silence to win again. Then she said, "Thank you." Her voice was rough from months of disuse, barely louder than the wind, but it was her voice. It was unmistakably, irreplaceably, miraculously her voice. Elias made no sound. He pulled his daughter to his chest, and he held her in the kind of embrace that has no language, only weight and warmth and the complete collapse of every doubt you ever carried. His shoulders shook. His tears fell into her hair. When he finally looked up, the stranger was already walking away through the market crowd, unhurried, as if he had simply done a small, ordinary thing and had 100 more to do before evening. Chapter 5. What he found that night. That night, Elias could not sleep. Miriam slept deeply for the first time in months, her breath soft and even. Elias sat beside his window and looked out at the dark hills and tried to understand what had happened. Not just what had happened to Miriam, but what had happened to him. Because something had shifted in him too, and it had shifted before Miriam spoke. It had shifted the moment the stranger said the ground beneath your prayer is already moving. Elias thought back over the 11 months. He had prayed, yes, but had he believed? He had spoken the words, but had he trusted that anything was listening, that anything was responding, that beneath the hard surface of his circumstances, something was growing? He realized, sitting there in the dark, that he had been praying the way you drop a stone into a well and then walk away, never waiting to hear the splash. He had spoken his requests and then retreated into despair, as if the words had nowhere to go. But a prayer is not a stone. A prayer is a seed. And seeds do not need your constant supervision. They need soil, which is your faith, and water, which is your persistence, and time, which is the one thing we are always most reluctant to give. He remembered the tiny green shoot he had seen that morning beside his prayer stone. He had thought nothing of it at the time. Now it felt like a message he had almost missed. Chapter 6. The morning. After the next morning, Elias returned to his stone. He knelt, as he always did. But this time, before he spoke a single word, he placed his hand flat on the ground beside the green shoot. He pressed his palm against the dry earth, and he felt, or imagined he felt, a faint, deep warmth, the kind that lives below the surface where roots travel and ancient water hides. He prayed differently that morning, not desperately, not with the tight fists of a man who fears he is not being heard. He prayed with open hands, the way you offer something rather than demand it, with the specific, deliberate gratitude of a man who has seen enough to believe that what he cannot see is not necessarily absent. Miriam came out of the house while he was still kneeling. She stood behind him and watched. Then she knelt beside him, on the bare stone, and folded her hands the way she had seen him do 1,000 times. Together they prayed, and from somewhere in the still morning air, from everywhere and nowhere, the way grace tends to arrive, came the feeling that this was exactly where they were meant to be, exactly when they were meant to be there, and that the story was far, far from over. Epilogue. What the ground remembers. The green shoot beside the prayer stone grew. By the end of the month, it had become a small plant with wide leaves the color of new jade. By the end of the season, it had become a sapling that shaded the spot where Elias knelt. In 3 years, it was a tree, the only green tree on that dry hillside, and people from the village would come to sit under it when the sun was too harsh and the day was too heavy. No one knew how it had grown in ground so dry. Elias knew, but he never explained it. He only said, when asked, that some things grow in the dark long before anyone sees them. That growth does not require your permission or your observation. That the most important movements in the universe are the ones happening just below the surface of what you can see. Miriam grew too. She became known through the hills as a girl with an extraordinary voice. rest of his long life, not because he needed to convince anyone, not because he feared the silence, but because he had learned the most important thing a person can learn about faith. You do not pray to move God, you pray to move yourself out of your own doubt, your own despair, your own small certainty that nothing is happening. The ground beneath your prayer is always already moving. The only question is whether you will trust it long enough to see the breakthrough. On the day Elias died, his grandchildren found him as they always found him, kneeling beside the old stone, head bowed, hands open, the great tree above him rustling in the morning wind like applause. He was smiling.